My name is Alina Collins, and I was 34 years old when this happened. At that point in my life, I still believed that effort could substitute for position, and that insistency could soften hierarchy. I was the younger sister, the quieter one, the one who learned early that staying agreeable kept the air calm. Within our family, roles were rarely spoken aloud, but everyone seemed to know where they stood. I was the aunt who never arrived empty-handed. Birthdays, holidays, small milestones that didn't need celebrating, I showed up for all of them. I remembered preferences, allergies, passing comments about favorite snacks. I thought attentiveness was a form of respect, and that respect would eventually circle back. No one asked me to do these things. That felt important to me at the time. Family gatherings followed a familiar rhythm. Someone cooked too much food, someone else complained quietly in the kitchen. Children moved between rooms, half supervised, half ignored. I floated where I was needed, filling gaps before they were noticed. It felt useful. It felt safe. My sister had a different presence. She spoke with certainty, occupied space without apology, and made decisions that others adjusted around. I told myself we balanced each other out, that her confidence and my consideration were two sides of the same family strength. Looking back, I can see how fragile that belief was. Normalcy only exists when everyone agrees to maintain it. I didn't know yet how easily my place could be redefined, or how quickly familiarity could turn into something thinner, more conditional, without anyone announcing the change. At the time, I mistook stability for belonging, unaware that belonging can be quietly revoked when usefulness replaces mutuality, and silence becomes the price of staying welcome long enough to feel normal again later. Over time, generosity has a way of being renamed. In our family, mine stopped being described as kindness and started being treated as availability. It happened gradually, quietly enough that I didn't resist it. I was the one people checked with last, assuming I would adjust. If I hesitated, it was framed as confusion, not choice. My sister rarely asked outright. She implied. A comment about being busy, a look toward the children, a casual reminder that I was so good with them. I stepped in because it seemed easier than disrupting the flow. When I helped, it was expected. When I didn't, it was noticed. Appreciation thinned into assumption, and assumption hardened into routine. There were jokes that carried a small edge. Someone would laugh about how I spoiled the kids. Someone else would mention how I didn't have many responsibilities, as if time itself were something I owed. These comments were always said lightly, surrounded by noise and food, easy to dismiss without making myself uncomfortable by responding. I told myself this was normal. Families tease, roles form. Someone always becomes the organizer, the listener, the extra set of hands. I believed that stepping into that space meant I mattered. It never occurred to me that usefulness could replace respect without anyone needing to say so. By the time of that gathering, these patterns felt settled. I packed gifts automatically, I arrived early without being asked. Nothing about the day seemed unusual. It registered as another obligation, another chance to show up correctly. I didn't sense tension or warning. If anything, I felt practiced, confident in my place. That familiarity is what made what followed so disorienting. When a system feels stable, you don't brace for exposure. You assume the rules will hold, right up until they quietly don't. I had learned to read rooms, to anticipate moods, to smooth friction before it surfaced. That skill felt like maturity. I didn't recognize it yet as adaptation, or how easily adaptation can be mistaken for loyalty when no one else is required to bend in ways I never questioned. The gathering was loud in the way family events usually are, layered with overlapping conversations and the constant movement of people reaching for plates or refilling glasses. I arrived early, as I always did, helping set things out, asking where things should go. It felt automatic, almost comforting to stay in motion. Food covered every surface. Someone had brought too much dessert. Someone else complained about the heat. Children drifted between adults, carrying crumbs and half-finished stories. I smiled when spoken to, listened when needed, laughed in the right places. Nothing about my behavior was conscious. It was habit, rehearsed over years. My nephew was drinking more than usual. It wasn't hidden. Bottles opened, refilled, emptied. He was loud, affectionate, careless with his volume. The adults noticed, then chose not to. A comment here, a shrug there. Someone said he was just blowing off steam. Someone else joked that he could handle it. The moment passed. I registered it without alarm. Drinking had always been excused in our family, especially when it came from the younger men. I didn't feel responsible for it, but I also didn't feel surprised. I stayed where I was, handing out napkins, clearing empty plates, keeping my distance without leaving. As the evening wore on, his laughter sharpened. It cut through conversations instead of blending with them. I felt myself becoming more careful, quieter, though no one had asked me to be. That was familiar too, adjusting before friction had a chance to surface. Then, without warning, his attention shifted. His eyes settled on me for a fraction longer than before. The room didn't change, but something in the air did. I felt it before I understood it. That subtle tightening, the sense of being seen in a way that isn't neutral. He smiled, unsteady and curious, and I realized I was no longer part of the background. I'd become the focus, and whatever was coming was already forming, waiting for the moment it could be said out loud. I stayed still, listening to the room breathe around us, aware of how quickly attention can turn into permission. No one intervened. No one redirected him. The quiet felt deliberate, like a test I hadn't agreed to take. In that pause, I understood how exposed silence can be when it belongs to everyone but you, and it was already too late to pretend nothing had shifted. I didn't expect him to say my name, but he did, stretching it slightly, as if tasting it. His voice was playful, careless, louder than necessary. He laughed first, like he was giving everyone permission. Then he said it, that I was the sad aunt who tried to buy love, the one with gifts and favors and nothing else to offer. He waved his hand in my direction, not aggressively, just enough to include me. A few people laughed, not hard, not cruelly, but enough to break the quiet. Someone repeated part of it under their breath, smiling. Someone else shook their head like it was harmless. The word sad hung in the air longer than the rest. It didn't feel like an insult delivered in anger. It felt observational, like a label he assumed we all shared. I didn't respond. I remember noticing how calm my hands were, how steady my breathing felt compared to the noise in my chest. I looked at him, then at the room, waiting for someone to interrupt, to redirect, to say his name sharply and stop it. No one did. My sister didn't look at me. She focused on her glass, her mouth tight, expression unreadable. The silence that followed was heavier than the comment itself. It stretched, awkward and revealing. In that pause, everyone made a choice. Some chose to look away, some chose to smile politely, some chose to wait for me to fix it, the way I always fixed discomfort. I felt the expectations settle on me like weight. He laughed again, louder this time, relieved that no one had challenged him. The moment passed because it was allowed to. Conversation resumed in pieces, stitched back together poorly. I nodded when someone spoke to me, as if nothing had happened. I didn't leave. I didn't cry. I stayed where I was, performing normalcy because it seemed required. Inside, something cracked quietly. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to let doubt in. I replayed his words, but more than that, I replayed the faces around me, the neutrality, the comfort with letting it stand. I understood then that the exposure wasn't accidental. It had been made safe by familiarity. I realized the damage didn't come from a drunk comment alone. It came from the permission that surrounded it, from the way humor was used as cover, and from how easily my role could be reduced without resistance. Standing there, composed and silent, I felt the first fracture between who I thought I was to them and what I actually represented when no one felt compelled to protect me anymore. I stayed until the end, collecting plates, accepting small talk, letting the evening close around me. The joke was already being forgotten by others, folded into the noise. For me, it lingered, not as anger, but as clarity beginning to surface. I didn't know what would change yet, only that something already had, quietly, without permission or warning to anyone. After that night, the sound of the room stayed with me longer than the words themselves. I replayed the moment in fragments while doing ordinary things, washing dishes, driving to work, folding laundry. Each replay felt slightly different, as if I were searching for a version where I had misunderstood it. I asked myself if I had leaned too hard into being helpful, if my gifts had crossed some invisible line into embarrassment. The question followed me quietly. I examined my past behavior with an unfamiliar suspicion. Every remembered gesture seemed suddenly negotiable. I wondered if I should have arrived later, spoken less, offered nothing unless asked. The idea that I might have created the version of myself they saw felt heavy, but also strangely logical. If no one defended me, maybe there had been nothing to defend. I didn't feel angry. Anger requires certainty, and I didn't trust mine. What I felt instead was a dull ache of correction, the urge to refine myself into something more acceptable. I imagined pulling back without explanation, becoming smaller in ways that wouldn't be noticed. I rehearsed future gatherings in my head, practicing restraint as if it were maturity. My sister didn't reach out, neither did anyone else. Their silence felt neutral, which somehow made it worse. It left me alone with my interpretations, free to assume responsibility for the discomfort. I told myself they were busy, that I was overreacting, that humor shouldn't be taken seriously. These explanations sounded reasonable when repeated often enough. At night, I lay awake cataloging what I could change. Fewer gifts, less availability, no anticipation. I framed these thoughts as growth, as self-awareness finally catching up with me. It didn't feel like punishment yet. It felt like adjustment, like learning the rules properly after misreading them for years. Over time, the questioning became tiring. There are only so many times you can interrogate yourself before the answers blur. The more I revisited the memory, the less sharp it became. Not because it hurt less, but because it revealed more. I began to notice how quickly I had turned inward, how naturally I had assumed fault. That realization didn't arrive with relief, it arrived with exhaustion, a quiet awareness that I had been doing this for a long time, long before that night. That self-blame had always been my first response, my most reliable reflex. The thought didn't resolve anything yet, but it softened the edges of the memory. It created a pause, small but meaningful, where clarity could eventually settle. I noticed how easily kindness had been reframed as excess, and how quickly I accepted that reframing without challenge. The pattern was familiar once I let myself see it. I adjusted before anyone asked. I apologized without being accused. I made space where none was offered in return. This wasn't new behavior born from that evening, it was a continuation. Recognizing that didn't absolve the pain, but it redirected it. Instead of circling the comment, I began circling my response to it. The energy it took to keep rewriting myself became impossible to ignore. Fatigue replaced shame. Not because I forgave anyone, but because I could no longer sustain the effort of disappearing in hopes of being received more gently later by those I trusted most. I didn't wake up one morning feeling different. The shift was slower than that, almost unremarkable. It arrived as a pattern instead of a revelation, formed by repetition rather than shock. I started noticing how my worth appeared strongest when I was useful, how conversations warmed when I offered something tangible. When I had nothing to give, the temperature changed. No one asked how I felt. No one seemed curious. The silence around my inner life had always been there. I had just been too busy filling it to notice. It wasn't cruel, just consistent, and consistency can be harder to question than intention when it feels familiar and earned. Once I saw that, the incident with my nephew loosened its grip. It became evidence, not the source. I realized I had been rewarded for effort, not presence, and tolerated for silence. The affection I felt wasn't returned, it was managed. I had confused being needed with being valued. That distinction settled slowly, without anger, but it rearranged everything. I stopped asking myself how to be easier. I stopped rewriting my past to justify their comfort. It wasn't empowering. It was quiet, almost disappointing, like learning the rules after the game had already been played. I simply stood still with the knowledge and let it sit without defending myself internally. What surprised me was how little explanation I needed once I stopped offering it to myself. I didn't confront my sister. I didn't replay conversations out loud. I simply withdrew my internal justifications. The habit of explaining had kept me tethered. Letting go felt unfamiliar, slightly empty, but also steady. I began noticing how often I had softened my edges preemptively, how rarely anyone met me halfway. There was no speech, no declaration, no demand for understanding, just a private recalibration that didn't require witnesses. It wasn't dramatic enough to be noticed, but it changed where I placed my energy, and what I no longer volunteered without being asked again. With that clarity came restraint. Not as punishment, not as strategy, but as relief. I stopped filling silence immediately. I allowed pauses to exist without rushing to resolve them. When messages went unanswered, I didn't follow up. When plans formed without me, I didn't correct the oversight. Each choice felt small, almost passive, yet internally deliberate. I didn't announce boundaries because I wasn't enforcing rules. I was responding to information that had finally registered. Energy pulled back naturally when effort stopped being rewarded. It wasn't withdrawal meant to be seen. It was alignment, quiet and unannounced. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear and steady inside. That clarity didn't push me toward confrontation. It pulled me toward distance. Not emotional coldness, but measured absence. I began preparing myself to step back without explanation, to let the system respond to what was no longer being supplied. There was no satisfaction in this decision, only calm. What came next would unfold without my narration, and for the first time, that felt like enough. I trusted silence more than dialogue now, because silence had already told me the truth, and I was finally willing to listen. Not for their reassurance, but for my own steadiness. The movement ahead would be quiet, unexplained, uninterrupted, entirely mine, and long overdue. Finally. I stopped arriving early, not abruptly, not with explanation, just 5 or 10 minutes later than usual. I brought fewer things with me, sometimes nothing at all. The absence felt louder to me than it appeared to others, but I held it quietly. No one commented at first. They adjusted, the way people do when they assume something temporary has shifted. I didn't volunteer information anymore. If someone asked how I was, I answered honestly but briefly. I didn't expand. I didn't redirect questions back to them to keep conversation moving. When plans were discussed, I listened without offering to organize or help. It felt awkward at first, like standing still on a moving walkway. I had to resist the impulse to step forward and make it easier for everyone else. Gifts became occasional instead of automatic. I chose them carefully, or not at all. I noticed how often the giving had replaced conversation, how objects filled the space where curiosity never lingered. Without that buffer, interactions grew shorter, more transactional. I let them. People began to notice, but not clearly. Someone asked if I was tired. Someone else joked that I'd gone quiet. My sister mentioned I seemed busy, her tone light, unconcerned. No one asked why. They filled the gap with assumptions that required no response from me. I watched how the system compensated, tasks redistributed unevenly, tension surfaced in places I used to smooth over. Small inconveniences lingered longer than before. I didn't step in, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because I no longer believed it was my responsibility to prevent discomfort that wasn't mine. There was a strange relief in doing less. My calendar felt lighter. My body did too. I wasn't bracing for reactions or preemptively apologizing. I let silence do its work. If something needed addressing, it remained unaddressed unless someone chose to name it. Most didn't. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They accumulated. Missed details, mild irritation, a subtle shift in tone. I observed without commentary. This wasn't revenge, it was exposure. When reliability disappears, what remains becomes visible. I stayed calm, letting the imbalance speak for itself, and in that quiet, I sensed movement beginning elsewhere, beyond my control, finally responding to the space I had stopped filling. I noticed how quickly my absence was framed as distance, not choice. That interpretation protected them from reflection. It also freed me. I didn't correct it. I let misunderstandings stand where explanation once lived. Each time I stayed silent, something shifted outward instead of inward. The weight I used to carry redistributed itself unevenly, and for the first time, it wasn't mine. That mattered more than I expected then. Quietly, finally, I began to notice the effects, slowly, in places I no longer stepped into. Plans fell apart more easily, details were missed. My sister sounded sharper on the phone, impatient in ways she never directed at me before. She didn't accuse, she hinted, comments about how things used to run smoother, how everyone seemed stretched lately. I listened without offering solutions. My nephew avoided me at first, then he acted overly casual, louder than necessary, as if proximity could reset the balance. There was no acknowledgement of that night, no attempt to revisit it. His discomfort showed up sideways, in sarcasm and short replies. When I didn't absorb it, it lingered uncomfortably. Without my involvement, expectations had nowhere to land. Requests went unanswered longer. Tasks were reassigned awkwardly. Small tensions surfaced and stayed visible. I watched these shifts without satisfaction or guilt. I didn't step forward to correct them. I also didn't withdraw completely. I remained present, just not useful in the way I had been. What unsettled them wasn't my absence, but my neutrality. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain the change. That left them without a script. My sister grew quieter around me, then distant. Our conversations narrowed to logistics. Anything emotional stayed untouched. There was no confrontation, no apology waiting to be accepted, just a gradual understanding that access had changed. The system adjusted poorly, then reluctantly. I felt no urge to repair it. Distance formed naturally, like a boundary no one had to announce. As the weeks passed, I felt myself separating emotionally, not in anger, not in grief, but in recognition. I stopped expecting to be understood. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. The space between us widened without discussion, and for the first time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like alignment, quiet and irreversible, settling into place. I noticed how resentment replaced expectation without ever being spoken. It appeared in sighs, in delays, in the way my name entered conversations less often. No one named the shift, which allowed it to exist without resolution. I didn't try to soften it. I let it sit where clarity belonged. This wasn't closure. It was distance becoming permanent, shaped by choice rather than conflict. And it prepared me to step further back without explanation, carrying calm instead of obligation. I understood that separation was already complete, long before anyone acknowledged it aloud or questioned it. Distance didn't arrive as emptiness, it arrived as quiet. Without the constant effort of anticipating needs, my days felt longer, less crowded. I noticed how rarely I checked my phone after family conversations, how little I replayed exchanges in my head. The absence of that reflex felt unfamiliar, then relieving. I began to recognize myself outside their expectations, not as the helpful one or the accommodating one, but simply as myself, unmeasured. My choices no longer required justification. If I declined an invitation, it was because I didn't want to go, not because I was tired or busy or unavailable in a socially acceptable way. The difference mattered more than I expected. Peace settled in gradually. It wasn't joy and it wasn't numbness. It was steadiness. I slept better. My body felt less tense. I stopped scanning rooms for approval that never fully arrived anyway. Their moods stopped dictating mine. I didn't feel victorious. There was nothing to win. What I felt was ownership of my time, of my attention, of my emotional energy. I realized how much of myself I had been distributing without noticing the cost. Reclaiming it didn't make me harder, it made me clearer. Occasionally, I sensed their confusion from a distance, a comment passed along, a change in tone. I didn't lean in to interpret it. I let it pass without translation. Their understanding was no longer required for my comfort. This version of myself wasn't louder or more impressive. She was quieter, more selective, and less interested in being seen. I trusted her instincts more than their perceptions. As that trust settled, the story I had carried about my place in the family loosened. It didn't need rewriting, it simply lost relevance, making space for an ending shaped by self-respect rather than explanation alone. I don't think about that night as a turning point anymore. It feels more like a confirmation, something that revealed what had already been true beneath the surface. What stayed with me wasn't the comment or the laughter, but how quickly I learned what silence costs when you pay it repeatedly. I didn't lose my family. I lost an illusion about my role within it. I learned how easily generosity can become a currency and how quietly it is devalued once it's expected. I learned that overgiving doesn't make you indispensable, it makes you invisible. And I learned how often I confused endurance with loyalty, mistaking discomfort for connection because it was familiar. The distance I chose wasn't punishment. It wasn't a lesson meant to be felt by anyone else. It was protection, for my time, for my energy, for the parts of me that had learned to shrink without being asked. Creating space allowed me to see myself without their reflection, and that mattered more than being understood. There was pain in letting go of the version of myself that believed effort could secure belonging. I don't deny that, but the pain didn't linger. It softened into acceptance once I stopped negotiating with it. I didn't need closure from them. I needed honesty with myself. I still attend gatherings occasionally. I still show up when I choose to, but I arrive whole, not useful, present, not available. The difference is quiet but decisive. I no longer perform for acceptance. I don't measure my worth by response or silence. Peace didn't come from being redeemed, it came from clarity, and clarity, once settled, doesn't require permission to stay.